She had been in his estate for 3 days. She had not once looked at him. Every woman in England wanted the Duke of Wetherbourne's attention. They dressed for it. They laughed louder for it. They positioned themselves in every doorway he might pass through. But Clara Everleigh sat in his library with a candle and a 100-year-old letter, and when Alexander Veilhart finally walked through that door, the most powerful man in Cornwall, the man every family wanted, she looked up for exactly 1 second, then looked back down. And that was the moment the Duke of Wetherbourne lost everything he thought he wanted. Before we begin, subscribe to the Duke's Diary and stay with us until the very end. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. The winter gathering at Wetherbourne Hall had been Alexander Veilhart's idea, which meant it was also his punishment. Every year his secretary compiled the list. Every year Alexander reviewed it and changed nothing because the list was never truly his to change. The guest roster at a ducal estate was a document of obligation. This family owed that favor. This alliance required maintenance. This young woman's father had done something useful in Parliament. The gathering existed to keep those threads intact. Alexander existed at these events primarily as the reason the threads mattered. He stood at the entrance to the main hall and watched his guests arrive. Lady Harrington's 3 daughters entered in coordinated pale blue. They had planned this. Alexander recognized the middle shade slightly deeper on the eldest, who was supposedly the most eligible to draw the eye upward. It was well executed. He felt nothing. Lord Pemberton's niece arrived next, arm in arm with her mother, and both of them angled immediately towards the position closest to where Alexander typically stood. They had studied the room in advance, he had no doubt. "Your Grace." His secretary Dawson materialized at his shoulder with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent 12 years learning exactly how close to stand. "Lady Reyes has requested." "Later," Alexander said. "The Harrington family." "Dawson." Dawson fell silent. Alexander took a glass of wine from a passing tray, looked at the room and thought, "This is my life. Every single piece of it assembled for someone else's purpose." The thought was not new. It arrived most evenings in the hour between dinner and the business of the night, and he had learned to set it aside, the way he set aside anything that could not be immediately acted upon. You did not dismantle 40 years of institutional duty because of a feeling. You carried the feeling, and you continued. He crossed the hall toward the east corridor, where the noise was slightly lower. He did not intend to enter the library. The library was simply the first quiet room. He noticed her the moment he stepped through the door, which was unusual because the library was large enough that a person could easily go unobserved in its far corners, and because he had not been looking for anyone. She was at the reading table nearest the window, a woman he did not recognize, which was itself remarkable at his own gathering. She sat sideways in the chair, one knee bent beneath her in a posture that suggested complete unconsciousness of her surroundings, and would have scandalized at least 4 of the women currently competing for his attention in the main hall. A candle burned close to her right hand. She was holding a document old by the look of it, and she was holding it at an angle. He recognized immediately as the angle of someone who had spent years reading aged manuscripts in difficult light. She did not look up. Alexander stood in the doorway for a moment and waited for the social calculation that usually occupied these pauses. Who is she whose daughter? What does her family need? What am I being positioned toward? And found to his genuine surprise that none of it came. She simply had not looked up. He walked into the room. "That document," he said, "is from the estate collection." She looked up then. Not with alarm, not with the sudden bright performance of a woman caught in a favorable position, but with the mildly interrupted attention of someone who had been concentrating on something more important. "Yes," she said. "I know, I'm cataloging it." Her voice was unhurried. Her eyes moved from his face back to the document for just a moment, not dismissively, but the way a craftsperson checks their work before setting it aside, and then she gave him her full attention. "I'm Clara Everleigh. Mr. Dawson hired me to assess the family archive." "I know who you are," Alexander said. This was not true, but it seemed important in this particular moment not to admit otherwise. Clara Everleigh looked at him with an expression that suggested she was perfectly aware he was not telling the truth, and had decided it was not worth correcting. "This letter," she said instead of pursuing it, "is from 1773. It's in reasonable condition considering it was stored loose." She turned it slightly toward him. "Your great-grandfather's handwriting, I believe. He writes to someone identified only as E, which is interesting because the estate records from that decade don't list any correspondence partner by that initial. The address on the outer fold has been deliberately removed." Alexander looked at the letter. He said nothing for a moment. "Deliberately," he repeated. "Yes. The fold pattern is different from the surrounding page. Someone removed it carefully, not through deterioration. You can see the edge here." She indicated the margin without touching it, a precision he recognized. Someone wanted to preserve the letter, but erase who sent it. Alexander looked at her. "You've been in my library for 2 hours, she said. "Mr. Dawson showed me in at 4:30. And in 2 hours, you found a letter that none of my archivists have mentioned in 30 years. Your archivists," Clara Everleigh said, with the particular tone of someone being tactful, "appear to have organized the collection by size rather than date or type, which is not uncommon. It simply makes things harder to find." Alexander set down his wine glass. He looked at the woman sitting in his library, discussing his family archive with the calm directness of someone who saw a task clearly and had no particular investment in whether the task's owner was impressed. Every woman in his main hall had arrived tonight to make an impression on him. This one was explaining that his archivists had filed his family history incorrectly. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me," he said. Clara Everleigh looked at him for exactly 1 second, evaluating he understood whether he meant it. Then she turned back to the document. She did not ask if he was certain. She did not make a show of gratitude for his attention. She simply moved the candle slightly, repositioned the letter, and said, "The paper composition is consistent with mid-18th century production. You can see the laid lines here, and the watermark in the upper corner is a maker's mark. I've only seen in documents from the Bristol trade route, so the letter was almost certainly written between 1768 and 1778, which matches the decade your great-grandfather was managing the coastal shipping contracts. You can date paper by looking at it." "By looking at it carefully," she said. "Most people don't." "What else?" She pointed to the script. "His handwriting changes midway through this paragraph. The pressure increases, the strokes get heavier. Whatever he was writing about in the second half of this letter, it mattered to him more than the first half." Alexander leaned forward. She was right. He could see it, the subtle shift in the ink weight, the letters pressing slightly deeper into the paper. He had looked at his great-grandfather's handwriting before on formal estate documents, and it had always seemed measured, careful, aristocratic. This was different. "What does the second half say?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "It says," she began, then stopped. "It says that he is sending the final payment, and that after this, the matter is closed, and the person he's writing to must understand that what was done cannot be made right, only managed." The silence in the library was very specific. "The final payment," Alexander said. "For what?" "The letter doesn't say." Clara set it down carefully. "But I found it in a box with several other documents from the same decade. Some of them reference a family called Whitmore. Do you know the name?" Alexander did not answer immediately. He had heard the name Whitmore. Not often. Not in any context that came with explanation. He had heard it once from his father, who had said it quickly and then changed the subject in the deliberate way of someone closing a door. "Continue," he said. "Takai." From the main hall. The sound of the gathering reached them intermittently. Music, laughter. The specific hum of assembled social performance. Neither of them acknowledged it. Clara walked him through what she had found in 2 hours of careful work. 7 documents, 3 of which referenced the Whitmore name. 2 of which appeared to be copies of agreements rather than originals, and one that was a fragment of something larger, the bottom third of a page. Both edges clean cuts, the top removed deliberately. "Someone went through this archive," she said. "Not recently. Perhaps 40 or 50 years ago. And they removed specific things. Or moved them. Possibly. If they're elsewhere in the collection, I can find them. But from what I've seen so far—" She paused. "From what I've seen so far, I think someone was very careful about what they left behind." Alexander looked at the 7 documents arranged in the order she had placed them on the table. "How long," he said, "would a complete assessment take of the full archive?" Clara considered it with the practical attention of someone calculating a real problem. "The collection is significant. If it's as disorganized as this section, and if there are removed or misfiled documents throughout several weeks, possibly 6. "I want it done," he said. Clara looked at him. "I was hired for a preliminary assessment," she said. 3 days. If you want a full restoration and cataloging, that's a different arrangement. Then we'll make a different arrangement." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Dawson handles the contracts." "I know who handles the contracts," Alexander said. He stood. "I'll speak with him tonight." He moved toward the door. "Your Grace." He turned. Clara Everleigh was looking at him with an expression that was direct, without being confrontational, the look of someone who had decided something was worth saying. "You should know," she said, "that I'm going to catalog everything I find, accurately, whatever the documents say." "I would expect nothing less," he said. "Some people," she said, "expect discretion. They want the uncomfortable parts left unrecorded." "I want the truth," Alexander said. He heard himself say it, and was surprised by how certain it sounded. "Then we understand each other," Clara Everleigh said. She turned back to her documents. He stood in the doorway for 1 moment longer than necessary. She did not look up. Dawson found him in the corridor 5 minutes later. "Your Grace, Lady Harrington is requesting Miss Everleigh's contract," Alexander said. "Extend it. 6 weeks minimum. Full access to the archive, the storage rooms, and any relevant correspondence files." Dawson blinked. "The preliminary assessment was—" "I'm aware of what the preliminary assessment was." Alexander kept walking. "Change it." "The cost." "Dawson." A pause. "Yes, Your Grace? And tell whoever is supposed to be greeting guests at the east entrance that they've abandoned their post." He walked back into the main hall, accepted a glass of wine. He didn't intend to drink, and spent the next 40 minutes performing the precise social calculations that the evening required. The whole time, some part of his attention remained in the library, on a letter written to someone identified only as E, whose address had been deliberately removed. On the words, "What was done cannot be made right, only managed." On a woman who had told him she would record everything accurately, and had looked at him steadily while saying it, waiting to see if that was a problem. It was not a problem. It was the first interesting thing that had happened to him in longer than he could clearly remember. Lady Harrington's eldest daughter found him near the fireplace at 8:30. Her name was Cecilia. She was beautiful in the specific curated way of women who have been prepared for events like this one since childhood. The right posture, the right tone, the right selection of topics designed to display intelligence without challenging. She was not unintelligent. Alexander had no doubt she was entirely aware of every calculation being made in this room, including her own. "Your Grace," she said, "I hope the evening is going well." "It's going exactly as planned," he said. Cecilia smiled. "Your estate is extraordinary. The North Gallery." "Tell me something you actually think," Alexander said. Cecilia stopped. He watched her recalibrate the precise social moment when a woman who has prepared for one kind of conversation realizes the conversation is not going where expected. To her credit, she handled it without visible alarm. "I think," she said carefully, "that events like this one are very useful for families with daughters and very exhausting for everyone else." "That's honest." "You asked for honesty." "I did." He looked at her. "You'd be happier somewhere else tonight." Cecilia considered this. "There's a lecture at the Literary Society in Bristol that I wanted to attend. Historical correspondence of the Tudor period. My mother felt the timing was inconvenient." "Your mother is strategic." "Deeply." Cecilia agreed. Then, with a directness that surprised him, "You're not what I expected, Your Grace." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to perform for," she said. Then she seemed to realize she'd gone slightly further than intended, and her social training reasserted itself. "I apologize. That was accurate," Alexander said. "Don't apologize for accuracy." Cecilia Harrington looked at him for a moment, with something that was almost curiosity. The real kind, not the performed kind. "The woman in the library," she said. "Is she part of the estate staff?" Alexander kept his expression entirely still. "She's an archivist." "Ah." A pause. "My maid mentioned she'd been there since this afternoon, reading old letters." Another pause shorter. "She didn't come in for dinner." "She was working." "Yes." Cecilia's tone was thoughtful. "I noticed you didn't come back to the hall for almost an hour." Alexander looked at her steadily. Cecilia smiled a smaller, more genuine smile than the ones she'd arrived with. "I hope the archive is interesting," she said, and moved away. The night deepened. Guests dined, circulated, performed. Alexander fulfilled every obligation with the precision of long practice. The correct number of minutes with each significant family. The correct degree of warmth toward those who required encouragement and distance from those who required management. He did it the way he did everything that belonged to the role completely competently and from a place of almost total emotional remove. At 10:30, he excused himself from a conversation about the spring parliament session and walked back through the east corridor. The library was still lit. He stopped in the doorway. Clara Everleigh was at the same table, but the arrangement had changed. She had spread several more documents across the surface, and she was making notes in a small leather book with the focused speed of someone transferring information before it slipped. A second candle had been added. Her hair had come slightly loose at one side, and she hadn't fixed it. She looked up. "Your gathering is still going," she said. "I'm aware. I thought you'd be occupied all evening." "I was." He came into the room. "What did you find?" Clara looked at him for a moment again, that evaluating pause, and then she turned the leather book toward him. "3 more references to the Whitmore family," she said. "And something more significant." She pulled a document from the side of the table. "This is a property agreement, dated 1771. Your great-grandfather transferred the title of a coastal parcel to a man named Richard Whitmore, for look at the amount." Alexander looked. It was almost nothing. An amount so far below any reasonable land value that it could only mean one of 2 things. Either the land had been considered worthless at the time, or the transaction had not been a sale. "It was a settlement," he said. "That's what I think," Clara said. "Not a sale, a settlement. And the terms are written in language that suggests it was meant to end something, a dispute, a claim, some prior arrangement that needed to be closed." "What was the dispute?" "The document doesn't say. The explanation has been removed." She indicated the lower half of the page. "Cut away. Same method as the letter, deliberate, careful. Someone processed this family's archive specifically to remove the reasons for these agreements while leaving the agreements themselves in place." "Why would you leave the agreements?" "Because they created legal title. You can't remove evidence of a land transfer without creating a different problem. Whoever held that land needed the paper trail. But you can remove the explanation." She paused. "Which means someone thought the explanation was more dangerous than the fact of the payment." Alexander stood at the table and looked at the documents. His family had paid someone called Whitmore for land that was worth far more than the listed price. After something happened that required management. His great-grandfather's words. "What was done cannot be made right, only managed." "I need to see the full archive," he said. "I know. How long before you can give me a complete picture? Of what's there? A week. Of what's missing, I can't tell you that until I understand what should be there." She met his eyes. "But I can tell you that this archive has been interfered with. And whatever the original truth was, someone in your family decided it was worth hiding." The fire shifted in the grate. From the hall, the faint sound of music continued. Alexander said, "My father once said the name Whitmore. Once when I was perhaps 12. He said it and then stopped and changed the subject. I remember because he never mentioned it again." Clara watched him. "He knew," Alexander said. not a question. Someone in your family knew, Clara said. For at least 2 generations. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, whatever you find, document it. All of it. That's what I said I'd do. I know, I'm saying it again. He looked at her directly. I want the real history, not the version someone decided I should have. Clara Everleigh held his gaze. All right, she said. She picked up her pen. He did not return to the gathering. Dawson found him in the study at midnight and reported that the final guests were departing. The Harrington family expressed hope that, note it, Alexander said. He was looking at a map of the Cornwall estate, the coastal properties, the boundaries, the parcels that had been in the Valehart family for 2 centuries. Somewhere in that map was a piece of land that had been given away for almost nothing in 1771. To a family called Whitmore, after something happened that required management. Dawson, he said. Yes, Your Grace. Is there anything in the family's legal records about a Whitmore? Dawson was quiet for exactly 1 second longer than usual. Not that I'm aware of. Check. Yes, Your Grace. And make sure Miss Everleigh has everything she needs. Whatever she asks for, materials, access, additional staff if necessary. Of course. A pause. She's still in the library, sir. I know, Alexander said. He turned back to the map. Outside the windows, the winter night was completely silent. The guests gone, the carriages departed. The performed warmth of the gathering dissolved back into the cold reality of the estate in winter. He traced the coastline with 1 finger. What was done cannot be made right, only managed. Someone had believed that. Alexander had spent his entire adult life managing the legacy of this family. The reputation, the debts, the alliances, the careful maintenance of a name that had been handed to him like a weight and a title simultaneously. He had been told in 100 different ways by 100 different people that his first duty was to the Valehart name. He had believed it. He believed it less tonight than he had this morning, and he was not entirely sure, examining that change, whether it was the documents that had shifted something, or the woman who had looked up from them with absolutely no interest in impressing him and told him she would record everything accurately and waited without apology to see if that was acceptable. It was. He had not realized until she said it how rarely anyone said that to him. She was gone when he passed the library again. At midnight, the documents repacked with evident care. The candles extinguished, the leather notebook gone with her. The room was darker and quieter and had the specific quality of a space where careful work had been done. On the corner of the reading table, she had left a single page, a summary in her clear, unhurried handwriting, listing the 7 documents she'd examined, their approximate dates, and 3 questions in the margin. Who is E? What was the original dispute with the Whitmore family? Why preserve the agreements but destroy the reasons? Alexander folded the page and put it in his coat pocket. He stood in the empty library. In the main hall, 12 women had arrived tonight with the explicit or implicit purpose of capturing his attention. One woman had spent the evening cataloging his family's hidden history and had left him 3 questions he didn't know how to answer. He was still thinking about her when he went to bed. He was still thinking about her when he woke. That he recognized had not happened in a very long time. Outside, the winter night had settled completely over Wetherbourne Hall. The fires were banked. The rooms were dark. The gathering, the music, the performance, the careful choreography of ambition dressed in silk was over. But in the East Wing, in the archive room that no one had properly entered in 30 years, a story had already begun. It had begun the moment a woman looked up from a very old letter and told a duke the truth. And the duke, for the first time in years, had not asked her to stop. Clara returned the next morning at 7. Alexander knew because Dawson told him, and Dawson told him because Alexander had asked to be informed the moment Miss Everleigh arrived at the estate. He did not examine this too carefully. He simply noted the information, finished his coffee, and gave it 20 minutes before walking to the archive. She was already deep in the collection when he arrived. Not at the reading table this time, but standing at the far wall with a lantern held close to one of the upper shelves, running her finger along the spines of document boxes, with the systematic patience of someone who had done this 100 times and trusted the process completely. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early," she said without turning. "The morning light is better for assessing paper condition. The color shifts in the afternoon." "What are you looking for?" "The gaps." She moved to the next section. When someone removes documents from a collection, they almost never refill the space. There are physical absences, places where something should be judging by the surrounding material, but isn't. She stopped. "Here." She stepped back slightly so he could see. "This box is labeled 1769 to 1774, but the boxes on either side of it are full. This one has perhaps a third of what it should contain." Alexander looked at the box. "That's the same decade," he said. "Yes." Clara took it down carefully and carried it to the table. Whoever went through this archive wasn't random. They had a specific target. She opened the box. Inside, 11 documents. The surrounding boxes, she had said, were full. This one should have held 30, perhaps 40. "Someone took 20 years of very careful hiding," she said quietly, "and did it well enough that a casual review would never catch it. But they didn't account for someone who looks at physical structure rather than just content." Alexander pulled a chair to the other side of the table and sat down. Not as a gesture, not performing interest, he simply sat down because this was where the work was. "Show me everything," he said. They worked through the morning together. It was an unusual experience for Alexander, not the working which he did constantly, but the working alongside. He managed an estate of significant size and employed dozens of people with specific competencies, and he was accustomed to receiving their expertise in the form of reports, briefings, summaries. He was rarely in the room while the actual work happened. Clara did not report to him. She worked and she talked while she worked, explaining what she found as she found it in the direct, unhurried way of someone who had decided provisionally that he could keep up. He could keep up. He was surprised to discover that surprised him. "This fragment," she said, holding a half-page to the light, "references a vessel, the Ardmore. Do you know the name?" "There's an Ardmore in the estate shipping records from the 1770s, one of the coastal traders. Cargo vessel, primarily wool, some timber." She set the fragment down carefully. "It's mentioned here in connection with a payment, the same payment structure as the Whitmore settlement. Same kind of language, same removal of explanation." She looked at him directly. "Your family had a financial relationship with someone on or connected to that vessel, and something went wrong. You can tell that from a fragment. I can tell that from the pattern," she said. "Individual documents tell you facts. The pattern tells you the story." She sat back. "I've been doing this long enough to recognize when a collection has been curated by someone frightened rather than someone careful. Careful people organize. Frightened people remove." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "Whoever did this," he said, "they were protecting someone. Or protecting themselves. The question is whether what they were protecting is still alive in some form. Whether it has consequences now." Clara looked at him steadily. "That's the question I'd want answered if this were my family." "It is my family." "Then you already know the answer. Matters." Dawson appeared at the archive door at 11:30, with the particular expression of a man carrying information he had not enjoyed finding. "Your Grace, you asked me to check the legal records." "I did." Dawson entered, which he did not do unless the information was significant. He placed a folder on the corner of the table. "There is a mention of the Whitmore family in the estate's legal correspondence, once, in a letter from the family solicitor dated 1803. He glanced at Clara just briefly, the professional assessment of someone calculating how much to say in present company. "Miss Everleigh stays," Alexander said. Dawson continued. "The letter was written to your father. It advises him that a man named Thomas Whitmore had contacted the firm seeking information about a property transaction from 1771. The solicitor's advice was that no response be made and the inquiry be allowed to lapse." The room was entirely still. My father received that letter, Alexander said. Yes, Your Grace. And responded by doing nothing, by following his solicitor's advice as far as the records show. A pause. There is a handwritten note in the margin, in what appears to be your father's hand. Dawson opened the folder and placed the letter on the table. Alexander looked at the margin, his father's handwriting. He knew it immediately, the upright, slightly compressed letters of a man who wrote quickly and economically. 2 words. Leave it. The silence stretched. Clara did not say anything. She did not reach for the document, did not press forward, did not fill the silence with anything that was not hers to fill. She simply sat with the steadiness of someone who understood that certain moments required exactly this. Thank you, Dawson, Alexander said finally. Dawson left. Alexander looked at those 2 words for a long time. Leave it. His father had been a serious man. Not cold. Alexander had never thought of him as cold, but serious in the way of someone who carries responsibility as a physical weight and has learned to live with the posture it creates. He had spoken about the Veilhart name often, about what it meant, what it required, what it was worth protecting. He had never mentioned the Whitmore family. He had simply written 2 words in a margin and let the question die. He knew, Alexander said. He knew something, Clara said. Careful, exact. He chose not to know more. She was quiet for a moment. That's a different thing from knowing. Is it? He looked at her. If someone hands you a question and you write, leave it in the margin, how is that different from knowing? It's the difference between inheriting a locked room and choosing to keep it locked, she said. The first generation locks the door. The second generation decides not to open it. By the time it reaches the third generation, she paused. By the time it reaches you, the lock has become invisible. You didn't know there was a door. Alexander looked at the letter. There was always a door, he said. Yes, Clara said. There was always a door. He left her to work afternoon and attended to the estate business that had accumulated overnight, a dispute between 2 tenant farmers over drainage rights, a quarterly report from the coastal property manager, a letter from his solicitor in London regarding a parliamentary matter that required a response before the end of the week. He handled all of it with the competency of long practice and the specific divided attention of a man whose mind was partly elsewhere. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Aldrich, his housekeeper, requested a moment. Mrs. Aldrich had been managing Wetherbourne Hall for 19 years. She was a woman of considerable practical intelligence and very few unnecessary words. When she requested a moment, there was generally a reason worth attending to. The guests from last evening, she said. There has been some talk. Alexander waited. Lady Harrington's maid spoke with 2 of the footmen this morning before the family departed. About the library. A pause. About who was in it. Miss Everleigh is a hired archivist, Alexander said. Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Aldrich's tone communicated in the specific shorthand of 19 years that the accuracy of this statement was not the point. Lady Harrington's maid described Miss Everleigh as a young woman who had the Duke's attention for most of the evening. That description will be shared. Then it will be shared. Your Grace. Is there something specific you're advising me to do, Mrs. Aldrich? A pause. I'm advising you to be aware of how things appear, particularly to families who came last evening with certain expectations. Those families, Alexander said, can manage their own expectations. Mrs. Aldrich looked at him for exactly 1 moment, with the expression of someone who has 19 years of context for exactly this kind of statement and its consequences. Very well, she said, and left. He returned to the archive at 4. Clara was standing at the window with her notebook, not writing, just thinking, the pen resting against her lower lip, her eyes unfocused in the middle distance. She looked for a moment like someone who had found something they were not yet sure how to handle. She didn't hear him come in. Clara. She turned. The first time he had used her name without the formality of her surname, and he had not intended to. It had simply come out that way, direct and unplanned, and he did not take it back. She did not remark on it. I found the vessel records, she said. The Ardmore. Something in her voice made him cross the room without asking. She opened the notebook to a page of careful notes. It ran the coastal route between Cornwall and Bristol from 1765 to 1773. Cargo vessel. Your family held a contract with the shipping company that owned it. She paused. In 1770, there was an incident, a cargo loss. The records I've found describe it as a storm, which is plausible. It was the right season, but there's a claim document in the box that doesn't match a storm. What does it match? A decision, she said. The cargo manifest lists 34 items. The claim was filed for 31. 3 items were not included in the claim. She looked at him. That's not how storm losses work. You don't omit cargo from an insurance claim. You claim everything. Unless the 3 missing items were not lost in the storm. They were taken off the vessel, or they were never on it to begin with. She turned to the next page of notes. And the cargo manifest for the preceding voyage, the one before the storm, lists a name I've now seen in 3 separate documents. Alexander waited. Richard Whitmore, she said. He sailed on that vessel, as a passenger, not crew, 3 weeks before the storm. The weight of it settled in the room between them. He was there, Alexander said. How was connected, Clara said. To the vessel, to your family's contract, to the decade your great-grandfather was writing letters to someone named E. about payments and things that couldn't be made right. She closed the notebook. Something happened on that route. Something that involved a man called Whitmore, a vessel your family had financial interest in, and an outcome that someone subsequently spent considerable effort removing from the record. And then in 1771, my great-grandfather transferred land to Richard Whitmore for almost nothing. Which was either a payment, Clara said, or a settlement. Or hush money. She held his gaze. That's a possibility. He turned away from her and stood at the window, looking at nothing. Running the sequence in his mind, the vessel, the missing cargo, the man who traveled on it, the land that changed hands for a fraction of its value. The letters with their addresses, removed the agreements with their explanations, cut away his father's 2 words in a margin 60 years later. Leave it. A family had been bought into silence. And then 3 generations later, someone named Thomas Whitmore had written to the estate solicitors asking about a property transaction. Had been told nothing, and apparently had gone away. Is Thomas Whitmore still living? He asked. I don't know, Clara said. I only have the name from your legal records. I want to find out. Clara was quiet for a moment. What are you planning to do if he is? Alexander turned back to face her. I don't know yet, but I want the complete truth first, whatever it is. He looked at her steadily. Whatever it costs. She searched his face for something sincerity, he thought, or some sign that he understood what he was committing to, and then she nodded once, the nod of someone accepting a piece of information and working with it. Then I'll keep looking, she said. What neither of them anticipated was that someone was already watching. He did not know this until the following morning, when a note arrived by private messenger. No estate seal. The handwriting on the outer fold, unfamiliar. The message inside, brief and deliberate in the way of someone who has chosen every word. Your Grace. It has come to the attention of certain parties that you have engaged a Miss Clara Everleigh in an extended capacity at Wetherbourne Hall. Given Miss Everleigh's background and the nature of her access to your family's private records, those with your best interests in mind would counsel discretion. A woman of her station in such proximity to the Duke creates an impression that no amount of professional explanation will fully correct. We write only out of concern for the Veilhart name. No signature. Alexander read it twice. Then he set it on the desk, sat back, and spent approximately 3 minutes deciding what he thought. The conclusion was simple. The note was cowardice dressed as concern. It had come from someone who had been at the gathering. Someone who had noticed Clara in the library and had noticed Alexander's interest and had decided to act on that observation before it became inconvenient for whatever plans they'd had for the Duke of Wetherbourne's future. He put the note in the fire. He went to the archive. Clara was at the table with 3 documents spread in front of her, and she looked up the moment he walked in with an expression that told him before he said a word that something had already changed. "Who spoke to you?" he said. She paused. "This morning, when I arrived." She set her pen down carefully. "One of the women from the gathering, Lady Harrington's friend. I didn't catch her name. She was in the courtyard when I came through the gate." "What did she say?" Clara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was with the measured tone of someone relaying information they have already processed and decided not to be wounded by. "She said she hoped I understood the nature of my position here, that the Duke of Wetherbourne was a man of very considerable standing, and that allowing a wrong impression to form would be harmful to everyone involved." A pause. She said it pleasantly. "I imagine she did." She also said that archivists who developed personal ambitions above their professional role rarely found further employment in good houses. The words landed in the room with a quiet, specific weight. Alexander looked at her. Clara's face was entirely composed. This was, he recognized, not the same thing as unbothered. It was the face of a woman who had been bothered and had already moved through it to the other side, because being bothered was a luxury she had learned not to afford. "She had no authority to say that," Alexander said. "She had social authority," Clara said, "which in my world is often the only kind that matters. Not in this house." "No." She looked at him. "But I don't only work in this house, and she knows that." The directness of it stopped him, not the words, but the steadiness behind them. The complete absence of drama or plea. She was simply showing him a fact the way she showed him facts in the archive and letting him decide what to do with it. "Did she threaten you?" "She warned me," Clara said. "The difference is whether I listen." "And do you intend to?" She looked at him for exactly the length of time required to make the answer real rather than automatic. "I intend to finish what I started. What happens after that?" She paused. "That's not something she gets to decide." Alexander felt something shift, not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, but the specific internal movement of a position reconsidered. He had spent his life surrounded by people who managed everything through social pressure, who wielded reputation like a tool, who considered consequence the most important dimension of any action. He had operated inside that system so long that he had nearly forgotten it was a system rather than a fact. Clara Everleigh was reminding him. "Then we continue," he said. She picked up her pen. "There's something you need to see," she said. The document she placed in front of him was newer than the others. Not 18th century, this was early 19th, the paper still cream rather than brown, the ink still dark. "It was misfiled in the 1769 box," she said, "which is how it survived. Whoever processed this archive would have found it if it had been in the correct location, but it was buried in the wrong decade." He looked at it. A letter, dated 1803, the same year as the solicitor's letter to his father, the one with the leave it in the margin. But this was not from a solicitor. The handwriting was unfamiliar, urgent in its pressure against the page, the letters uneven in the way of someone writing in emotional extremity, rather than professional communication. "Your Lordship, I write on behalf of my father, Thomas Whitmore, who is an old man now and will not trouble your family much longer. But I write because he asked me to, and because I believe he is owed the truth, even if he will never receive the justice. In 1772, your family's vessel, the Ardmore, carried cargo that did not belong to your great-grandfather. My father was on that vessel because he had been hired to transport documents, private legal documents belonging to a third party. Those documents disappeared during the voyage. The claim was filed as a storm loss. But the documents were never lost. They were taken. My father knows who took them and why. He has been silent for 30 years because silence was the price of the land your great-grandfather gave him. He is still silent. But he wants you to know that the silence was never agreement. It was survival. When your lordship is ready to know the full truth, Thomas Whitmore's family will be found in Falmouth. We have waited a long time already." The letter was signed, Elizabeth Whitmore. E. The room was entirely silent. Alexander read it again. And again. "E," he said. "The letter your great-grandfather wrote," Clara said, "to someone identified only as E, about the final payment. About what couldn't be made right. She paused. Elizabeth Whitmore. This is from 1803. She wrote to my father. Your father received this letter, Clara said quietly. Received it, filed it in the wrong box, accidentally or not, wrote, "Leave it," in his solicitor's margin, and never responded. Alexander set the letter down. There was a family in Falmouth. A family that had been bought into silence in 1771 had written a letter in 1803 saying, "We have waited a long time already," and had received no answer. That had been 22 years ago. I need to know, Alexander said, if Thomas Whitmore is still living. I can't find that from the archive. No. He stood. But Falmouth is 6 hours from here. Clara looked at him. You're going. Not tonight. He was already thinking through the logistics, the estate obligations, the timing. But soon. He looked at her. I want you with me. She was quiet. You found this, he said. You understand the context better than anyone else will. When I speak to this family, if they're still there, I need someone who can evaluate what they tell me against what we've already found. That's a professional reason, she said. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Is it the only reason? The question sat between them with a weight that was not precisely about Falmouth, and both of them were aware of this. No, Alexander said. He did not elaborate. He simply answered honestly the way she answered him, and let it stand. Clara was quiet for a long moment. All right, she said. She turned back to the documents. Outside the archive door, the sound of the estate, going about its afternoon business, continued, footsteps, the distant instruction of a housekeeper, a carriage on the courtyard stones. The ordinary machinery of a life, Alexander had managed for 15 years with precise and exhausting competency. He looked at the letter from Elizabeth Whitmore. He wants you to know that the silence was never agreement. It was survival. A family had waited 30 years to say that, had written it into a letter and sent it to a man who wrote 2 words in a margin and turned away. Alexander thought about what it costs to wait that long. He thought about the woman across the table from him, who had been warned this morning by a woman with social authority, and had not flinched, and had not asked him to fix it, and had said simply, that's not something she gets to decide. I thought about what it would mean going forward to be the man who finally answered the letter. I was still thinking about it when Clara looked up from her work an hour later and said without preamble, there's one more thing. He waited. The cargo, she said. The documents that disappeared from the Ardmore in 1772. Elizabeth Whitmore says her father was hired to transport private legal documents belonging to a third party. She paused. Those documents were taken, not lost in a storm, taken by someone on that vessel. My family's vessel, under your family's contract. She met his eyes. The question isn't only what happened to the Whitmore family. The question is, what were in those documents, what was worth stealing, and where are they now? The question landed, and Alexander understood with the specific clarity of someone who has just seen the actual shape of a problem. They thought they understood that this was not a story about a land settlement and a family paid into silence. This was something larger, something that 3 generations of his family had worked carefully and consistently to make invisible. And Clara Everleigh, in 4 days with a lantern and a notebook, had found the edge of it. The carriage to Falmouth left Wetherbourne Hall before dawn. Alexander had told Dawson only that he was attending to a property matter on the coast. This was true enough to be stated without elaboration, and Dawson, who had spent 12 years learning when elaboration was welcome, and when it was not, did not ask. Clara had arrived at the gate with a leather satchel and her notebook, dressed practically without the hesitation of someone second-guessing her decision. They did not speak much in the first hour. The road was rough in the dark, and the rhythm of the carriage made extended conversation difficult, and there was a particular quality to the silence between them that had developed over the past 4 days. A silence that no longer needed to be filled because it was not empty. Alexander was aware of this. He noted it the way he noted things that represented a change from a previous state. At some point past the first hour, Clara said, "Tell me about your father." He looked at her. "Not the public version," she said. You already told me the public version without meaning to. Tell me what he was actually like. It was not the kind of question people asked him. People who wanted to know about his father asked about his tenure, his parliamentary record, his management of the estate. They asked about the Duke. How was meticulous, Alexander said. He kept records of everything, his correspondence, his decisions, his reasoning. He believed that a man who couldn't explain his choices in writing hadn't examined them carefully enough. And yet he wrote 2 words in a margin and never answered a letter. Yes. That's not meticulous, Clara said. That's a man who knew something he didn't want to examine. Alexander was quiet. I was also, he said after a moment, the kind of man who believed that the damage you don't touch doesn't spread. That some wounds close on their own if you simply don't disturb them. He paused. He was wrong about that, but he believed it. Did you believe it too? Before this week? The question was direct in the way she was always direct, not aggressive, not designed to wound, simply honest about what it was asking. He considered it seriously. I believed that the Veilhart name was worth protecting, he said. I didn't ask too carefully what I was protecting it from. Clara looked at him for a moment. That's an honest answer. You tend to produce honest answers, he said. It's inconvenient. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the consideration of one. I've been told that before. By people who meant it as a criticism. Usually, yes. I don't mean it as a criticism. She looked at him. Then, the full direct look she gave things when she was genuinely paying attention, and something in the quality of the carriage's silence shifted. Not dramatically. The way light shifts when a cloud moves. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Falmouth was a working port town, practical, unsentimental, with the specific energy of a place where commerce happened at the waterline and everything else organized itself around that fact. Alexander had expected to search. He had brought the name and the date of the letter and the general sense that a family called Whitmore had been in this town for at least 22 years, and he had accepted that finding them might take time. It took 40 minutes. The harbor master knew the name immediately. Thomas Whitmore had been dead for 11 years, he said, but the family was still here. His daughter ran a small copying business near the East Docks, letters and documents for hire. Her name was Margaret. The old man had had 2 children, Margaret and a son, who'd gone north years ago. What about Elizabeth? Clara asked. The harbor master looked at her. Elizabeth was the eldest. She died in 1809. Clara and Alexander exchanged a look. Elizabeth Whitmore, who had written the letter in 1803, had died 6 years after writing it, having never received a response. Margaret Whitmore was perhaps 45, with the practical directness of someone who had spent her life in work rather than social performance. She looked at Alexander when he gave his name, and her expression did something complicated. Not surprise, not anger, but a long, slow recognition, the way a person looks when something they expected for a very long time finally arrives. I wondered, she said, if anyone from Wetherbourne would ever come. She let them in. The room was small and orderly, the specific order of a professional who works at home, every surface organized for function. She sat across from them at the work table and folded her hands and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting for 2 decades and had developed considerable capacity for it. Your sister wrote to my father in 1803, Alexander said. She wrote twice, Margaret said. The first letter we know he received because his solicitor acknowledged it. The second, she paused. We never knew if it arrived. Alexander looked at Clara. Clara opened her cell and withdrew the letter, the one she had found misfiled in the wrong decade, the one with Elizabeth's handwriting, the one that had been buried for 22 years. She placed it on the table. Margaret Whitmore looked at it. She reached out and touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, very gently, the way Clara touched old documents, with the involuntary care of someone who understood something was fragile. It arrived, Margaret said quietly. He just never opened the door. I'm opening it now, Alexander said. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Assessing the way, Clara assessed the way women who had learned to depend on their own judgment, assessed measuring sincerity against the evidence available. "You want to know about the Ardmore," she said. "I want to know everything." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father was hired in 1772 to transport a document case from Bristol to a solicitor's office in Plymouth. The case contained the original will and estate papers of a man named Grenville, a landowner who had recently died. His family was in a legal dispute over the inheritance, and the documents needed to reach Plymouth for a hearing. Your father was a courier, an independent one. He was trustworthy. He had a reputation." Something in her voice carried the weight of what that reputation had cost him. "He boarded the Ardmore with the document case. He kept it locked. He was careful." She paused. 2 days into the voyage, he discovered the case had been opened. The documents were still inside, but they'd been read, and one page was missing. "What page?" "The critical one," Margaret said. "A codicil to the will. It changed the inheritance split significantly. It favored the younger son over the eldest. The eldest son's lawyers had known the codicil existed. They needed it to disappear before the Plymouth hearing." The silence in the room had weight. "Someone on that vessel," Alexander said, "removed the codicil." "Someone connected to your family's contract with the shipping company," Margaret said. "My father didn't know who, not at first. But after the voyage, after the case arrived in Plymouth with the page missing, and the Grenville hearing went the way the eldest son's lawyers needed it to go, my father started asking questions." She looked at Alexander steadily. He found out. He found out who had access to his cabin, and who had a reason, and who had been paid. And then your great-grandfather appeared with a land offer, and a very clear suggestion that my father's health and continued livelihood depended on his memory of that voyage becoming selective. "He took the land," Alexander said. "He had a family," Margaret said. "Not defensively, simply as a fact. A wife who was unwell, 3 children. The land was worth something. His testimony against a duke's solicitors would have been worth nothing." Alexander sat with that for a moment. "The Grenville family," he said. "The younger son, what happened to him?" "He lost the estate," Margaret said. "Without the codicil, the eldest son inherited everything. The younger son died poor from what my father understood. He had children." She paused. "We don't know what happened to them." Clara had been making notes. She looked up now. "The documents that were taken, the codicil, do you know if it still exists?" "My father believed it was destroyed," Margaret said. "But he wasn't certain. He never saw it taken. He only knew it was gone." She looked at Clara, then at Alexander. "Why?" "Because," Clara said carefully, "if it still exists somewhere in your family's archive or elsewhere, it changes what's possible." Margaret frowned. "Possible how?" "A wrong was done," Alexander said. "To the Grenville family, and to your family. If there's documentation, if there's evidence that can be verified, then there are consequences that should follow." He held Margaret's gaze. "I am not my great-grandfather, and I am not my father. I am not prepared to write 'leave it' in any margin." Margaret looked at him for a long time. Something in her face shifted, not all the way to trust, because trust was not something that arrived in a single moment after 20 years of silence. But the door moved. "There is one more thing," she said. She stood cross to a small cabinet, unlocked it, and took out a box. It was old, older than anything else in the room. She set it on the table. "My father kept this," she said. "He said it was the only insurance he had. He never used it because using it would have required reopening everything. But he kept it." She opened the box. Inside, folded twice, preserved with the care of something that had been protected for 50 years. A single page of legal document paper, the handwriting formal. The seal at the bottom cracked but legible. Clara leaned forward. Her eyes moved across the page quickly, then slowly. Then she sat back. "That's it," she said. Her voice was completely steady, but her hand, Alexander noticed, was pressing flat against the table. "That's the codicil," Clara said. "The Grenville codicil. He kept it. He took it off the man who took it from him," Margaret said. "The night before the Ardmore docked, he couldn't undo what had already been done. The documents arrived in Plymouth without it. The hearing had already been scheduled. But he took it back. She paused. He said he took it so they would know that someone knew, so there would be a record somewhere. No one spoke. Alexander looked at the page. 50 years. This page had existed for 50 years in a locked box in Falmouth, while a family lost an estate, and the Whitmore family lost their name, and his great-grandfather wrote letters about things that couldn't be made right. "May I?" Clara asked. Margaret nodded. Clara lifted the codicil with both hands, careful, precise, the way she handled everything fragile, and examined it in the light. "It's authentic," she said. "The paper, the hand, the seal, it's consistent with the period. This is real." Alexander looked at her. "What does it mean?" he said, not asking her to explain what she already knew, asking her to say it aloud, because saying it aloud was different. "It means," Clara said, "that the Grenville family was defrauded, that the wrong son inherited, that whatever became of the younger son's line, his children, his grandchildren, they have a claim that was stolen from them." She set the codicil down. "And it means your family was the mechanism by which that theft was accomplished." The words were not cruel. They were exact. She said them the way she recorded things in her notebook because accuracy mattered more than comfort, and she had told him this from the beginning. He had asked for the truth. They were back in the carriage before dark, with the codicil enclosed in Clara's satchel between two pieces of protective card, and Margaret Whitmore's address in Alexander's pocket, and a great deal of silence between them. That was a different kind of silence than the one on the way down. "The Grenville family," Alexander said. "We need to find them." "I know. Whatever they're owed." "That's a legal question," Clara said. "I'm an archivist, not a solicitor. But yes, whatever they're owed needs to be determined by someone who can act on it. My solicitor in London will advise you to proceed carefully," Clara said. "Because that's what solicitors do. They advise caution because caution protects their clients." She paused. "The question is whether you want protection or resolution." Alexander looked at her. "Resolution," he said. She nodded. Not with relief, with the quiet acknowledgement of someone confirming that the person they were working with was who they had assessed them to be. They traveled in silence for a while. Then Clara said, "You should be prepared for what this means publicly." "I know what it means. Do you—" She turned to look at him directly, and her voice had the careful quality of someone who respected him enough to say the difficult thing. "This is not a family embarrassment that can be managed quietly. If the Grenville family is located, and the codicil is authenticated, and the original fraud is established, it will be public. It will be discussed. The Veilhart name will be connected to something that a court will characterize as— I know what a court will characterize it as. Then you know that some of the people who admired you last week will not admire you next month." He was quiet for a moment. "That was never the point," he said. "The point of what? Any of it." He looked at her. "The name, the gathering, the careful management of every relationship and alliance and expectation." He paused. "I have spent 15 years being the Duke of Wetherbourne, with great dedication and no particular sense that any of it meant something beyond its own continuation. And then you came into my library and showed me that the foundation of it was built on something I didn't know, and my father chose not to know, and my great-grandfather deliberately concealed." He held her gaze. "The admiration of people who admired me for a lie is not something I'm interested in protecting." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She turned back to the window. He watched her profile in the last of the evening light, the precise attention she gave to everything, even a passing landscape, the quality of presence that he had noticed from the first evening and had not stopped noticing since. She was not beautiful in the calculated way of women who had been prepared for his attention. She was something more specific than that. She was entirely herself, without apology, without performance. He had been surrounded his entire adult life by people performing themselves for his benefit. He had not realized until Clara Everleigh sat in his library and corrected his family archive how exhausted he was by the performance. They arrived back at Wetherbourne Hall after 9. The estate was quiet. Most of the staff had finished for the evening. Dawson met them in the entrance hall with the particular expression of a man who has been managing things in his employer's absence and has accumulated several items requiring attention. "There are 2 letters," Dawson said. "One from Lord Fenwick. He requests a meeting at your earliest convenience regarding the spring parliamentary session." He paused. "And one from Lady Harrington." Alexander looked at the sealed letter in Dawson's hand. He had a feeling without opening it about its general contents. "Leave them on the desk," he said. "I'll address them in the morning. Your Grace." Dawson hesitated, which was unusual enough that Alexander looked at him directly. Lady Harrington's letter arrived with a verbal message from her footman. The footman said that Lady Harrington wished you to know that she had spoken with Lord Aldwych about Miss Everleigh. The name Aldwych registered. Lord Aldwych was, among other things, the primary social arbiter of the county's professional and domestic hiring networks. A word from Aldwych could open or close the doors of every significant house in Cornwall and beyond. Alexander looked at Clara. Clara had heard. Her expression had not changed, but her hand had tightened slightly on the strap of her satchel, one visible sign of something being managed. "What exactly did she say?" Alexander asked Dawson. The footman's words were, "Lady Harrington has shared her concerns about Miss Everleigh's professional conduct with Lord Aldwych, and expects that appropriate decisions will follow." The room was entirely still. Clara set her satchel on the hall table. She turned to face Alexander, and her voice when she spoke was perfectly level. "She's telling you the price," she said. "If you continue the arrangement, she uses Aldwych to damage my reputation in the professional community. Not yours, mine." "That is not a consequence I will allow," Alexander said. "It's not yours to allow or prevent," she said, and her voice had an edge that was not anger, but something harder than anger. The specific refusal of someone who will not be protected at the cost of their own agency. "She can do it, Alexander. She has the connections and the motive and the social permission. And if it happens because I chose to continue this work, not because you failed to protect me." "Clara, don't," she met his eyes. "Don't take the choice from me, not even in the direction of protection." He stopped. He looked at her, the steadiness of her, the complete refusal to perform distress for an audience, even when she was clearly shaken beneath it, and he understood that this was what she had been from the first moment in the library. Not someone who needed management. Someone who needed simply to be allowed to make her own choices. "Then tell me what you want to do," he said. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was with the particular calm of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply stating it. "I want to finish what we found," she said. "The Grenville family, the codicil, whatever comes next." She paused. "I did not come here to advance myself socially. I came because the work is real and it matters. Lady Harrington threatening my reputation doesn't change what's in that archive or what's in my satchel." She looked at him. "Does it change anything for you?" The question was direct. It was also the question beneath the question, not merely whether he would continue the archive project, but whether when it cost something real, he was the man she had begun to believe he was. "No," Alexander said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her satchel. "I'll be in the archive at 7, she said. She walked toward the east corridor. He watched her go. Behind him. Dawson said very carefully, "Shall I draft a response to Lady Harrington, Your Grace?" "Yes," Alexander said. "Tell her the arrangement at Wetherbourne Hall reflects my professional judgment and is not subject to external review." He paused. "And tell her I've extended Miss Everleigh's contract through the spring." Dawson was silent for a beat. "She won't like that." "No," Alexander said. "She won't." He went to his study and opened the letter from Lady Harrington. It was exactly what he had expected. Elegant, concerned, wrapped in the language of social care, while functioning as a clear declaration of consequence. She wrote about the Duke's reputation. She wrote about the importance of appropriate appearances at a time when he was expected to be considering a formal alliance. She wrote that she had always admired him and would hate to see him damage himself unnecessarily. She did not write about Clara directly. She didn't have to. Clara's name was in every word of it. Alexander took the letter and put it in the fire. the same fire as the previous one. Then he sat at his desk and pulled out a blank sheet and began to write, not to Lady Harrington, but to his London solicitor. A different kind of letter. One that described a codicil, a family called Grenville, and a fraud committed 50 years ago that he intended to put right. He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, he sealed the letter and set it with the Morning Post. Then he sat in the quiet and thought about Clara, saying, "Don't take the choice from me, not even in the direction of protection," and about the way she had walked toward the archive with her satchel, and without looking back, and about how that simple, unperformed steadiness had become over 6 days the thing he looked for when he entered any room. He had gone through his entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. His name, his endorsement, his alliance, his attention, his hand in marriage. Clara Everleigh wanted to finish what she started. She wanted the truth to be recorded accurately. She had told him that the first night in the library before she knew anything about him, except that he was a duke who had asked her to show him something and appeared to be actually listening. He was listening. Was more than listening. He recognized it now with the specific clarity of something that has been true for longer than you noticed. Had been true probably since she looked up from the old letter and explained the difference between careful archivists and frightened ones, without any awareness that she was changing something in the room. He was in entirely serious trouble. What he did not know, sitting in his study in the late evening, was that across town, Lady Harrington's footman had already carried a second message, not to him, but to a third party. Alexander had not considered. He found out the next morning. He found out because Clara came to the archive at 7, as promised, set down her satchel, turned to face him and said, "Someone came to my rooms last night." He went very still. "Not threatening," she said, reading his face. "A man. He said he'd been sent by a Lord Pemwick. That Lord Pemwick had information about the archive project and wanted to discuss it privately." She paused. "He said Lord Pemwick had been watching the situation at Wetherbourne Hall with interest, and believed there might be documents in the Vailhart archive that had implications beyond the family's private history." "Implications for whom?" "He didn't say." Her voice was careful. "But he knew about the Ardmore. He used the name directly." She looked at Alexander. "He knew we'd been to Falmouth." The weight of that settled. Someone had been watching closely enough to know they'd made the journey. Closely enough to know which specific historical vessel they were investigating. And quickly enough to send a messenger by the following morning. "Who is Pemwick?" Clara asked. Alexander thought. Lord Pemwick Edmund. Pemwick, Baron of Carrow, was not someone he knew well. A peripheral figure in the county's social structure. Old money, modest estate. The kind of presence at large gatherings that was noted without being significant. Except he had been at the winter gathering at Wetherbourne Hall. He had been in the main hall when Alexander had been in the library, and he had a connection. Alexander placed it now, pulling the thread carefully. A familial connection to one of the legal firms that had operated in Bristol in the 1770s. His mother's family had been solicitors, Bristol solicitors. "He's connected to the original theft," Alexander said. Clara was completely still. "Not directly, he's too young, but his family was." He was thinking as he spoke, placing the pieces against what they already knew. A Bristol solicitor firm, the Ardmore, the Grenville codicil. Someone had to facilitate the legal side of what happened. Someone had to ensure the Plymouth hearing proceeded the way it did, even without the codicil. A solicitor firm with the right connections could have done that. "And now he knows we've found the codicil," Clara said. "He suspects." Alexander. Her voice was very quiet and very serious. "If he's connected to the original event, he has a reason to prevent whatever you're planning. Not just personal reputation, legal exposure. His family potentially." She paused. "That man who came to my rooms wasn't making an offer. He was making an assessment." Alexander looked at her. "He wanted to know what we had," he said. "And whether I could be separated from you before you act on it," she said. The sentence landed with a specific, particular weight. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without drama, without the performance of being frightened, simply naming the fact as a fact and letting him hear it. He heard it. "You should know," he said, "that you cannot be separated from this. Whatever happens next, whatever Pemwick intends, you found these documents. Your name is part of this record now." "I know that. I'm not telling you as a warning. I'm telling you because if you want to step back—" "I don't want to step back," she said. Immediate, clear. He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He thought of the letter already posted to his London solicitor. He thought of Margaret Whitmore in Falmouth, with 50 years of silence, finally disturbed. He thought of a codicil in Clara's satchel that had survived its own burial, because an ordinary man on a cargo vessel had understood that someone needed to know. "We move faster," he said, "before Pemwick can." Clara reached for her satchel. "Then we start now," she said. They moved fast. Clara spent the rest of that morning cross-referencing every document they had found against the codicil's specific legal language building, a sequential record that any solicitor could follow without the archive's physical context. Alexander sent a second letter to London, this one to a different solicitor, one recommended by his estate's legal counsel as someone who handled sensitive historical claims with both competence and discretion. He did not explain everything in the letter. "I explained enough." Dawson appeared at the archive door at noon. "Lord Pemwick has requested a social call," he said. "This afternoon, if convenient." Alexander and Clara looked at each other. "Tell him tomorrow morning," Alexander said. 10 o'clock. Dawson left. "He's moving," Clara said. "He's trying to get ahead of whatever he thinks we're planning." Alexander looked at the documents spread across the table. "If he arrives here, and we've already sent the codicil to London, the conversation changes." "The codicil should go today," Clara said. "I know." He looked at her. "Will you take it?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Not by post, personally. My carriage a trusted footman, and you carry it in the satchel until it's in my solicitor's hands." He held her gaze. "Do this." "I understand." She was already reaching for the satchel. "How long do you need me gone?" 2 days, 3 at most." He paused. "I'll handle Pemwick." Clara looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not fear, not reluctance, but the specific concern of someone who had been present for the full shape of a problem and did not like leaving before it resolved. "Don't tell him more than he already knows," she said. "Whatever he comes here claiming to offer, he's not offering anything. He's assessing." "I know. Alexander." She said his name with the particular weight of someone who used it carefully. "Be careful with what you say. Not because you can't handle him. Because he's had 50 years of family practice managing this secret, and you've had 8 days. He looked at her steadily. "I have you." "You have what I found," she said. "That's not the same as having me in the room." "No," he said. "It isn't." She held his gaze for one moment longer than the conversation required. Then she closed the satchel and walked out. He listened to her footsteps go down the corridor and thought that the specific quality of a room changed when she left it. Not dramatically, not like the extinguishing of something bright, but the way a room changes when the person in it, who was actually paying attention, has gone elsewhere. He had 8 days. She was right that he had 8 days. But he had also spent 15 years managing people who came into rooms with agendas. They called something else. And Lord Pemwick, whatever his family's history, was still a man who had sent a messenger to a woman's private rooms at night, rather than presenting himself at the front door. Alexander knew what that meant. It meant Pemwick was afraid. He spent the afternoon going through his family's legal correspondence with Dawson's help, not the archive documents which Clara had organized, but the current estate files, the ones from the past 20 years. He was looking for any direct connection between the Vailhart estate's recent legal arrangements and anything tied to the Pemwick family or their associated Bristol solicitor connections. He found it at 4:30, a contract renewal from 9 years ago. A standard coastal shipping agreement, the kind that had existed in various forms since his great-grandfather's time. The legal firm listed as the processing agent on the Pemwick side was called Caro and Associates. Caro. The same name as Pemwick's barony, his family's solicitor firm. Still operating. Still connected. Still apparently managing the legal infrastructure that had grown up around whatever had happened on the Ardmore in 1772, Alexander sat back. The original fraud had not simply happened and concluded, it had been maintained, actively professionally across generations. The Pemwick family had not merely inherited a secret, they had inherited a practice. An ongoing management of something that remained even 50 years later legally consequential. Which meant that what was in Clara's satchel, currently traveling toward London, was not merely historical. It was current. Pemwick arrived at 10 the following morning. He was perhaps 60, well-maintained, with the specific ease of a man who had never had to be uncomfortable in a room, and had therefore developed no particular skill for it. He sat in the chair Alexander indicated in the study, not the library. Alexander had chosen deliberately, and accepted coffee with the pleasant manner of someone paying a social call. "Your Grace," he said, "I appreciate you making time." "Lord Pemwick." Alexander sat across from him. "What can I do for you?" Pemwick smiled. "I'll be direct if I may. Please. It has come to my attention that you've been engaged in a review of your family's historical archive, with the assistance of a Miss Everleigh." He paused. "I understand she's been thorough." "She's an exceptional archivist," Alexander said. "I don't doubt it." The smile remained precisely in place. "I raise the matter because I believe she may have found documents that touch on some old business that involves tangentially my own family's history." "Tangentially," Alexander repeated. "My grandfather's firm handled legal matters for several estates in this region during the 1760s and 70s. It's possible some of that history intersects with your archive." He opened his hands in the gesture of a man with nothing to hide. "I thought it might be useful to compare notes before any documents are shared in context that might require clarification." "Clarification," Alexander said. "Historical records can be misread, particularly by people who weren't present for the original circumstances." Pemwick's tone was still pleasant, still entirely pleasant. "I have some family materials that provide context for certain transactions from that period. I'd be glad to make them available, in a spirit of mutual understanding." Alexander looked at him. "I understood the offer precisely." Pemwick was offering his version of the story before anyone else's version could be established. He was offering to provide context meaning interpretation for documents that told a clear story without his interpretation. He was offering this pleasantly early before anything reached a solicitor's desk. Because once it reached a solicitor's desk, the pleasantness stopped being useful. "I appreciate that," Alexander said. "Let me ask you something directly." "Of course." "The Ardmore, 1772. What does your family's material say about it?" The smile did not disappear, but something behind it adjusted a fractional recalibration. The specific movement of a man who has prepared for several conversations and is identifying which one this is. "A cargo vessel," Pemwick said. "My grandfather's firm facilitated the shipping contract, standard arrangement, and the Grenville documents that were aboard it." A pause. Shorter than it should have been for a man who wasn't expecting the question. "I'm not familiar with the specifics." "The codicil," Alexander said. "The one that changed the inheritance split. The one that disappeared before the Plymouth hearing." Pemwick was very still. "I'm afraid," he said carefully, "I don't know what document you're referring to." "Then your family's material won't be particularly useful," Alexander said, "since it apparently doesn't address the most significant event of that voyage." The pleasantness had not left Pemwick's face, but it had become a different kind of pleasantness, the kind that is maintained through effort rather than ease. "Your Grace," he said, "I came here in good faith." "You came here," Alexander said, "because someone you sent to Miss Everleigh's rooms at night reported back to you, and you decided the situation required personal management." He kept his voice even, not aggressive, simply exact. "The good faith version of this conversation would have happened through official channels with your solicitor present. You chose a social call because you wanted room to negotiate." Pemwick looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was gone, not replaced by hostility, by something more careful. The voice of a man calculating. "What is it you intend to do?" he asked. What should have been done 50 years ago, Alexander said. Find the Grenville family, present the evidence, allow the proper authorities to determine what comes next. That will cause considerable damage. To your family. To yours as well. Pemwick's voice was level. The Valehart name is connected to this. Your great-grandfather was not an innocent party. No, Alexander said. He wasn't. That's part of what will be made clear. Pemwick stared at him. You're prepared to damage your own name. I'm prepared to be honest about my family's history. There's a difference. Alexander held his gaze. A wrong was done. A family lost an inheritance. Another family was bought into silence. And 3 generations of Valarths chose not to know about it. He paused. I'm the 4th generation. I'm making a different choice. Pemwick was quiet for a long moment. You understand, he said, that this will not simply be a historical correction. There will be legal consequences. For my family, yes, but also reputational consequences for yours that... Pemwick. Alexander's voice was quiet. Final. The codicil is already in London. The silence was complete. Pemwick understood in that moment. Alexander could see it, the precise calculation completing in the older man's face, that the conversation he had come to have was already over. That the negotiation he had driven 6 hours to conduct had been foreclosed the previous afternoon by a woman with a satchel and a carriage. Miss Everleigh, Pemwick said. Miss Everleigh, Alexander confirmed. Something moved through Pemwick's expression, not admiration, but the specific recognition of a man who has underestimated an opponent and is honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. She won't be thanked for this, he said. In the professional community, in society, whatever you think you're protecting her from. She made her own choice, Alexander said. I didn't protect her from anything. I offered her the choice, and she made it. He stood. I think we're finished here. Pemwick stood. He was still composed, the composure of old money and long practice, the bearing of a man who had handled difficult situations before and would handle this one. But something had gone out of him. The certainty. The advanced confidence of someone who had arrived expecting to reshape a conversation. You're going to find, Pemwick said at the door, that honesty is considerably more expensive than you currently believe. I expect you're right, Alexander said. Send my regards to your solicitor. Pemwick left. Alexander stood in the empty study and let the quiet settle and thought about what he had just done. Not with doubt, the decision had been made before Pemwick arrived, had been made when he sent Clara to London, with the codicil had been made. If he was honest, when he sat in the archive at 7 in the morning 8 days ago and told a woman he had never met that he wanted the real history. But recognizing a decision and living inside its consequences were different things. He found Dawson in the corridor. Draft a letter to Lord Aldwych, he said. Dawson's expression was carefully neutral. Regarding Miss Everleigh. He held Dawson's gaze. Inform Lord Aldwych that Miss Clara Everleigh has been engaged by this estate in a professional capacity of the highest order, that her work has been exceptional, and that any suggestion to the contrary reflects a misunderstanding of facts that I am in a position to clarify personally. He paused. Make the tone clear. Dawson said, Lady Harrington will not appreciate that letter. No, Alexander said. She won't. It may affect certain social arrangements that have been... Dawson. He looked at his secretary steadily. Send the letter. Yes, Your Grace. He went back to the archive. He sat at the table where Clara worked every morning and looked at the organized collection around him, the labeled shelves, the careful documentation, the physical evidence of weeks of meticulous attention, and he thought about what she had said in the carriage. Don't take the choice from me, not even in the direction of protection. He had not taken the choice from her. He had given her the decision, and she had made it, and she was currently in a carriage with a 50-year-old codicil that was about to upend several powerful families, including his own, and she had made that choice herself, fully informed, without being asked to make it. He picked up her notebook. She had left the current one on the table, and he opened it to the most recent pages, not to read, but to look at the way you look at something when you are trying to understand what it represents. Her handwriting was clear and precise and unhurried. Notes in the margins, questions circled. The specific visual record of a mind that worked by examining everything before drawing conclusions. He had spent his adult life making decisions with imperfect information in conditions of social pressure for the benefit of a name he had inherited. He had been good at it. He had not been happy at it. He had not known until recently that those were two separable things. He closed the notebook carefully. Clara returned on the third day, as she had estimated. She came into the archive directly, coat still on satchel, now empty, and sat down across from him, with the expression of someone who has completed a difficult task, and is still in the specific physical state of it. "It's done," she said. "Your solicitor has the codicil, the supporting documentation, and the full written account of what we found. He's already identified a legal researcher to locate the current Grenville line. How long did he think it would take? To locate them? Weeks. To determine what's legally actionable." She paused. "Months, possibly. It's not simple. The original estate was entailed. What the younger son's descendants can claim today depends on how the property passed through several subsequent generations." She looked at him. "It won't be fast." "That's all right," Alexander said. She looked at him. "How was Pemwick?" "Exactly what I expected," Alexander said. "He came to negotiate. He left without an agreement." "He'll push back." "I know. His family's solicitor firm may have documentation that complicates the case. They had the resources to manage this for 50 years. They probably have material that presents their version coherently." "My solicitor is aware." Clara nodded, processing. "Then, you sent the letter to Aldwych." It was not a question. She had clearly spoken to Dawson. "Yes," Alexander said. She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to. It will create friction with Lady Harrington." "Lady Harrington," he said, "has already created friction. I'm simply responding to it." Clara looked at him with the direct, evaluating attention she had given him since the first night. He had learned to hold that attention without managing it, without performing confidence for her benefit or managing her impression of him. He simply held it the way he was trying to hold everything now, honestly, without the armor. "Why?" she said. He knew she wasn't asking about the letter to Aldwych specifically. "Because you told me on the first night that you would document everything accurately," he said. "And you did. Because when someone put pressure on you, you didn't ask me to resolve it. You told me not to take the choice from you." He paused. "Because you went to London with a 50-year-old document that could make your professional life very difficult, and you did it because the truth mattered more to you than the safety." He held her gaze. "I am not accustomed to people who operate that way. I found it. I find it something I don't have a sufficient word for." Clara was very still. "That's a great deal of observation for 8 days," she said. "You are not a difficult person to observe clearly," he said. "The difficulty is in deciding what to do with what you see." "And what have you decided?" The question sat between them with the specific weight of a question that is not actually about the archive, and both of them were aware of this, and neither of them moved to acknowledge it, and neither of them moved away from it. "I've decided," Alexander said carefully, "that there are things I would like to say to you that don't belong in an archive, and that I'm going to wait until this situation is sufficiently resolved that when I say them, they're not tangled up with everything else." He held her gaze. "Can you wait for that?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I've been finding missing documents for 15 years, she said. "I know how to wait for something important." He felt the specific warmth of that settle, somewhere it mattered. "Good," he said. She took off her coat and reached for her notebook. They went back to work. The following 2 weeks were the most complicated of Alexander's professional life. His London solicitor worked quickly and discreetly, locating the Grenville line with more speed than expected. A family in Hampshire reduced from their original circumstances, but intact, currently headed by a man named James Grenville, who was the great-grandson of the younger son, who had lost the inheritance in 1772. The solicitor's preliminary assessment was that the codicil, combined with the supporting documentation from the archive, established a compelling case for historical fraud. What remedy was available to the current Grenville family was a more complex question, but the solicitor was direct. The evidence was real, the fraud was demonstrable, and proceeding was the right thing to do. Pemwick's family predictably engaged their own legal counsel. 2 letters arrived from Caro and Associates. Within the first week, both of them calibrated in the precise language of legal threat, dressed as professional concern. They questioned the codicil's provenance. They questioned Clara's qualifications to assess its authenticity. They questioned the chain of custody, given that the document had been in private possession for 50 years. Alexander forwarded both letters to his solicitor without responding. Clara read them when he showed her and said, "They're going to argue that my assessment isn't credible, that I'm biased because of my relationship with the estate." My solicitor anticipated that. He's arranged for an independent authentication by a document expert from the British Museum. She looked at him. "That's expensive." "Yes." "You arranged it before receiving the letters." "I arranged it before you left for London," he said. "I anticipated this was coming." She was quiet for the moment. "You think ahead." "I manage a significant estate," he said. "I've spent 15 years thinking ahead." He paused. "The difference is that this is the first time in 15 years that what I was thinking ahead toward felt worth the effort." Clara set the letters down. She did not say anything, but the look she gave him had a quality he was learning to recognize, the specific look she reserved for information she was going to keep. The letter from James Grenville arrived 3 weeks after the solicitor first made contact. It was brief, handwritten, and very careful, the letter of a man who had received news significant enough that he was measuring every word. He wrote that his family had known in a general sense that something had been wrong with the original inheritance, that his great-grandfather had always maintained the codicil existed and had been taken. He had not known the specifics. He had not known anyone would ever be in a position to prove it. He wrote that he was grateful. He wrote at the end, "I do not know yet what this means practically for my family. But whatever it means, I want you to know that the fact of someone coming forward at all matters in itself. We stopped expecting that many years ago." Alexander read the letter twice. Then he went to find Clara. She was in the archive, where she was now working on the final organization of the collection, the last sections, the ones that had been least damaged and required documentation rather than restoration. She looked up when he came in and knew from his face that something had arrived. He handed her the letter. She read it standing up, which was how she read things when the content was moving. He had noticed this, her particular habit of needing to stay in motion when something landed. When she finished, she was quiet. "His great-grandfather always knew," she said, "and no one believed him. Or no one with the power to act on it was willing to." She looked at the letter. "They stopped expecting." She said it quietly, the weight of what that meant fully present in her voice. An entire family stopped expecting that anyone would come forward. "We came forward," Alexander said. "You came forward," she said. "I found the documents. You made the decisions. You made decisions too. You went to London." "That was easy," she said. And she meant it. He could tell she meant it, that the physical difficulty of the trip and the professional risk it represented were genuinely to her secondary to the fact that it was the right thing to do. That was just the work. He looked at her. I thought about everything she had called just the work over the past weeks. The careful hours in the archive. The woman in the courtyard who had threatened her professional future. The night messenger from Pemwick. The letter to Aldwych. All of it absorbed and processed and responded to with the same steady, unperformed calm. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I said I was going to wait until this was resolved," he said. "I realize it isn't fully resolved. The legal process will take months." He paused. "But some things I've found don't wait politely." She set the letter on the table. She looked at him with the full, clear attention she gave to things that mattered to her. "You said," she began, "that there were things you wanted to say that didn't belong in the archive." "Yes." "We're in the archive," she said. "I know," he said. "I changed my mind about the location." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "Tell me," she said. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be honest. And he said what he had been carrying for 3 weeks with the specific directness she had taught him by example. I have spent 15 years managing this estate, this name, and every relationship attached to it with complete competence and no particular feeling that any of it was mine, he said. I attended my own gatherings as an obligation. I met hundreds of people and found almost none of them interesting. I did what was required, and I did it well, and I was... He paused. I was empty, Clara. I had not noticed how empty until you sat in my library and told me you would record everything accurately. She was completely still. You didn't come here for me, he said. You came for the work, and the work was real, and you never pretended otherwise. You never asked me for anything beyond what you came to do. And somehow that was what finally... He stopped, started differently. I am not asking you for anything you haven't already chosen to give. I'm not asking you to disappear behind a title, or perform yourself for a social function, or be anything other than exactly what you are. He held her gaze. I'm asking if the man behind the title is someone you could want, not the Duke, Alexander. The archive was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment, the full evaluating honest attention of a woman who did not make decisions carelessly and was not going to make this one carelessly either. Then she said, The man behind the title was the one I noticed first. He exhaled. You never actually behaved like a duke with me, she said. From the first night. You sat down at the table and asked me to show you. You came back to the archive at 7 in the morning. You listened when I said things you didn't want to hear. She paused. The Duke part was incidental. The man was already there. Is that a yes? He said. She looked at him. It's a beginning, she said. Which is what everything worth having starts as. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood in the archive surrounded by the organized evidence of a long-hidden truth finally made visible, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because nothing needed to be said. Outside the estate continued. The legal machinery had been set in motion. The Grenville family was waiting for whatever came next. Pemwick's solicitors were drafting their response. The world that had organized itself around the Valehart name for 3 generations was in the process of being asked to reorganize around the truth instead. None of that was finished. But this, the two of them standing in this room, his hand holding hers, the specific quiet of 2 people who had arrived at the same place by entirely different roads. This had the feeling of something that had at last truly begun. The collection is almost finished, Clara said after a while. I know. Another 2 weeks, perhaps. Yes. She looked at him. What happens after the archive is complete? He looked at her steadily. Whatever you decide. I meant what I said. I'm not asking you to change what you do. I'm asking if you want to do it in proximity to me. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to every real question. The Grenville case will need documentation support, she said. For the authentication process. For the legal presentation. Someone who understands the physical evidence will need to be available. Yes, he said. They will. That's professional, she said. Entirely, he agreed. And after that, she said, there will be other archives. Other families with misfiled histories and removed pages and things that need to be found. She paused. The kind of work that takes someone who doesn't give up when the collection is difficult. I know someone like that, Alexander said. She met his eyes. I know you do, she said. The authentication results arrived on a Tuesday. Alexander was in the study when Dawson brought the letter from London, the thick formal envelope of his solicitor's firm, sealed with the kind of deliberate care that communicated significance before a single word was read. He opened it at the desk without sitting down, which was how he handled things when waiting was not possible. The document expert from the British Museum had examined the codicil. Her assessment was unambiguous. The paper, the ink composition, the handwriting analysis, against known Grenville family legal documents from the same period, all of it confirmed. The codicil was authentic. It predated the Plymouth hearing. It changed the inheritance split in favor of the younger son. And it had been withheld from the proceedings deliberately. She used that word specifically. Deliberately. Alexander read the assessment twice. Then he went directly to the archive. Clara looked up the moment he came in and read his face before he spoke. "It's confirmed," she said. "Completely." He placed the letter on the table in front of her. She read it standing the way she always read things that moved her. He watched her eyes move through the document expert's conclusions. Watched her reach the final paragraph where the word deliberately appeared, watched. Something settle in her face. Not satisfaction exactly, but the specific resolution of a person who has been carrying a question and has finally received its answer. "Now it's real," she said. "It was always real," he said. "Now it's provable," she said. "That's different." She set the letter down. "What happens next?" "My solicitor presents the authentication to the legal panel reviewing the Grenville claim. Pemwick's family has 2 weeks to respond to the formal evidence package." He paused. "After that, the process moves on its own timeline. And Pemwick himself. He hasn't contacted me since the morning he left this study." Alexander's voice was measured. "His solicitors are still active, but the authentication changes their position considerably. They were arguing about provenance. They cannot argue about the document expert's credentials." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He'll try something else." "Probably." "He still has social leverage. He can't fight the legal case, but he can make the public narrative painful." "He can try," Alexander said. "The public narrative has a document authenticated by the British Museum. That tends to be persuasive." She looked at him. "You're not worried." "I didn't say that." He held her gaze. I said the evidence is strong. Those are different things. I'm aware that this will continue to be uncomfortable for some time." He paused. "I find that I'm less concerned about the discomfort than I expected to be." "Because you've already decided." "Because I already decided," he confirmed, "some time ago." Clara picked up her pen and turned back to the final section of the archive. She was completing the last 2 boxes, which contained the most recent family correspondence and required the least restoration, but the most careful documentation. She worked in the comfortable silence that had become the texture of their shared mornings, and Alexander sat across from her and read through the supporting materials his solicitor had sent. And neither of them needed to say that the room had changed, and they had changed, and the estate had changed, and none of it felt any more like loss. Chore. 3 days later, Pemwick made his move. Not legally, socially. A letter appeared in the county's primary social correspondence network. The kind of letter that circulated among connected households, passed from drawing room to drawing room, with the deliberate momentum of something released rather than sent. It was not signed by Pemwick directly. It was attributed vaguely to concerned members of the county community who had become aware of the situation at Wetherbourne Hall and wished to share their perspective. The letter described Clara as a woman of modest background who had used professional access to gain improper influence over the Duke of Wetherbourne. It described Alexander as a man whose judgment had been compromised by an inappropriate personal attachment. It described the archive project as a manufactured justification for an arrangement that was at its core socially irregular. It did not mention the codicil. It did not mention the Grenville family. It did not mention the fraud. Mrs. Aldrich brought a copy to Alexander before noon. He read it once. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Lord Fenwick's household, I believe," Mrs. Aldrich said carefully, "though the original source is not identified." Fenwick, Alexander thought. Fenwick had requested a meeting weeks ago, the parliamentary matter. He had also, Alexander now recalled, been at the winter gathering. He had also, Alexander now recalled, been at school with Pemwick. "Of course. Your Grace." Mrs. Aldrich's tone was the tone of 19 years of honest service. "The staff have seen this. There will be talk." "There's already talk," he said. "This is more organized than talk." He looked at her. "Does anyone in this household believe a word of it?" Mrs. Aldrich was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. "No, Your Grace." "Good." He stood. "Then we continue." He found Clara in the archive. She was working, but something in the set of her shoulders when he came in told him she had already seen it. She looked up and confirmed it, the expression of someone who has absorbed a blow and made a decision about it, but hasn't finished processing the weight. Dawson showed me, she said. I know. It's well constructed, she said. Her voice was steady. It doesn't make claims that can be directly refuted. It's framed as concern. Concern is very hard to argue against. You don't need to argue against it, Alexander said. Easy to say. Clara. He sat across from her. Look at me. She did. This letter is the action of a frightened man who cannot fight the evidence, so he's attacking the people who found it, he said. That is a specific kind of desperation. It means he knows the legal case is real, and he has nothing left except the social one. The social one can still damage me, she said. Not with self-pity, with accuracy. She was simply reporting a fact. I know that. My professional reputation is not an abstraction, she said. It's what I live on. It's what allows me to do the work I actually care about. She looked at him steadily. If the houses in this county and beyond decide I'm what this letter says I am, they won't. You can't guarantee that. No, he said. I can't. He held her gaze. What I can do is make it unambiguously clear where I stand. Publicly, formally, and in terms that leave no room for interpretation. He paused. But I want to ask you before I do that, because doing it without asking would be taking the choice from you. She looked at him. What are you planning? She said. To respond to this letter, he said, with one of my own. Under my name, not anonymous. Describing the archive project, accurately describing your professional conduct accurately, and making clear that Miss Clara Everleigh has my complete confidence and support. He paused. And that anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to discuss the matter with me directly. That will make Pemwick's argument look exactly like what it is, she said. Yes. It will also make your personal position toward me very clear. Yes. She was quiet. That's a significant thing to put in a letter, she said. I know what it is, he said. I'm asking if it's what you want. Clara looked at him for a long moment, the full, serious, careful attention of a woman who had spent her entire professional life making decisions based on evidence and was applying that same discipline to this. Write the letter, she said. The letter went out that afternoon. It was 2 paragraphs. Alexander had written it himself without Dawson's assistance in the plain direct language he used when he had no patience for performance. It described Miss Clara Everleigh as one of the most skilled and principled professionals he had encountered in 15 years of estate management. It described the archive project as significant, valuable, and conducted with complete integrity. It stated that the anonymous letter circulating in the county reflected neither fact nor fairness, and that Alexander Veilhart, Duke of Wetherbourne, was prepared to stand behind that assessment without qualification. He signed it with his full title and sent it to every household that had received the original. Dawson, when he saw it, said nothing for a moment. Then, this will be the primary topic of conversation in every drawing room in Cornwall by tomorrow morning. Good, Alexander said. Then the primary topic of conversation will be the truth. What Alexander had not anticipated, what neither he nor Dawson predicted, was the response that arrived 2 days later from Cecilia Harrington. Not her mother. Cecilia herself. She wrote briefly, Your Grace, I have read both letters. I find on reflection that my own assessment of Miss Everleigh's character formed during the winter gathering aligns with yours. I hope the situation resolves as it should. Ch. Alexander read it and thought about a young woman who had wanted to attend a lecture on Tudor correspondence and had instead spent an evening performing for a duke who wasn't interested and who had told him with surprising honesty that events like that one were exhausting for everyone except the families with daughters. He showed the note to Clara. She read it and was quiet for a moment. She's braver than I gave her credit for, she said. People often are, Alexander said, when the situation makes it possible. 3 more letters arrived over the following week from other households in the county. People who had known Alexander for years and had apparently been waiting to see what he would do before deciding what they thought. None of them were effusive. They were simply clear. They accepted his account of the situation. They expressed continued regard. It was not universal. Several households that had been warm before the winter gathering did not respond at all, which was its own kind of response. 2 letters arrived that were polite in language and cool in substance, the kind of correspondence that communicates a relationship being managed rather than sustained. Alexander read all of it and filed it and continued. Pemwick sent no further communication. His solicitors, however, sent 3 more letters in 2 weeks, each one slightly less confident in its framing than the previous. The authentication had done its work. The legal case was building momentum that no amount of social maneuvering could stop. The archive was completed on a Friday morning in late spring. Clara finished the last documentation entry, closed the final box, wrote the concluding summary in her notebook, and sat back. She looked at the collection around her, fully labeled, fully housed, fully assessed and restored and organized into the sequence that made its story legible to anyone who came after. Alexander was at the table across from her. He had been there for the last hour, reading correspondence present the way. He had learned to be present, not managing, not directing, simply there. She said, "It's done." He looked up. She handed him the completed summary, 12 pages, in her clear, unhurried handwriting, describing every section of the collection, its condition, its contents, and its historical significance. He took it and read the first page, and then looked at her. "All of it," he said. "All of it." He set the summary down. He looked at the room, the organized, the careful order she had made from decades of neglect and deliberate interference, and his expression had the quality she had come to recognize as his version of deep feeling, not performed, not managed, simply present in his face, the way weather is present. "My father would not have allowed this," he said. "No. He would have said the risk wasn't worth it." "What do you say?" she asked. He looked at her. "I say the risk was the point," he said. "The risk was what made it mean something." Clara folded her hands on the table. "The Grenville case will continue without me now. Your solicitor has everything he needs." "Yes." "My professional engagement here is complete." "Technically," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about a proposal. A professional one initially, because I know you well enough to know the professional case needs to be real before the personal one will be considered." "You're learning," she said. "I'm observing. There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "The Wetherbourne archive is complete, but it needs ongoing management. Every estate of this age generates continuous documentation, legal, agricultural, familial. Someone needs to maintain the collection, assess new material, ensure that what happened to the last 50 years of records doesn't happen again." "A permanent position," Clara said. "A permanent position," he confirmed. "With full professional authority over the collection, appropriate compensation, and complete independence in how the work is conducted." He paused. Followed, "if you are willing," by a personal question that has nothing to do with the archive. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Ask the personal question first," she said. He was quiet for exactly 1 second, the pause of a man who had prepared one order of operations and was adjusting. "I love you," he said, simply, without preamble or construction. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say it, and I've decided there isn't a right moment. There's only the true moment, and this is it." He held her gaze. "I love that you corrected my archive on the first night. I love that you told me not to protect you without asking. I love that you went to London with a 50-year-old document because it was the right thing to do, and you didn't require me to tell you that." He paused. "I love that you are entirely, completely yourself in every room you enter without performing it for anyone." Clara was very still. "I am not asking you to become part of my world," he said. "I'm asking if we can build something that belongs to both of us." The archive was completely quiet. She looked at him the way she looked at the documents she cared most about, with full attention, with the patience of someone who understood that the most important things revealed themselves to people who were willing to look carefully and wait for what was actually there. "You said you were empty before this," she said. "Yes." "Are you sure it was me and not the work, the archive, the Grenville case, the decision to be honest?" "Clara." His voice was quiet. "I was doing the right thing long before you arrived." Duty management responsibility. All of it. None of it felt like anything. He paused. You walked into my library and didn't look up. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 15 years. He held her gaze. The work gave me a reason. You gave me back the capacity to feel that it mattered. She breathed. I'm not easy, she said. I argue when I think I'm right. I don't defer to titles. I will tell you things you don't want to hear. I know. I will not disappear into the role of Duchess, she said. Whatever that role requires, I will learn it, but I will not stop being who I am. I know that too, he said. It's not despite those things, Clara. It's because of them. She looked at him for one more long, serious moment. Then she said, yes. He exhaled the specific exhale of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has been told at last he can set it down. Yes, to which part? He said. Both, she said. All of it. He proposed formally 3 days later. Not in the archive. She had told him she wanted it somewhere that wasn't the archive, because the archive was her professional space, and she intended to keep the two things distinct, which he found entirely characteristic and entirely correct. He proposed in the library. The same library where she had been sitting on the first night, the same table, the candle in approximately the same position. He had not staged it deliberately. He had simply asked her to come to the library after dinner, and when she arrived and looked around and understood the choice of location, the corner of her mouth moved in the specific way he had memorized. The ring was simple, a sapphire dark blue set in plain gold. He had spent an afternoon choosing it and had been looking without examining why for something that suggested depth rather than display. She looked at it for a long moment. It's not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Something more ducal, she said. I was going for something more Clara, he said. She looked up at him. Something in her face opened, not dramatically, not with the performance of feeling, but the genuine movement of a woman who had spent her professional life careful with fragile things and was recognizing in this moment that she was allowed to be fragile herself. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. For the record, she said, this is not how I expected my life to proceed when I accepted a 3-day archive assessment. No, he said. I imagine not. I came here to catalog old letters. You did. And instead I found a 50-year-old fraud, antagonized a baron, alarmed Lady Harrington, and agreed to marry a duke. That is an accurate summary, he said. She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she produced rarely and without warning, and which was every time the most disarming sound he had ever heard. He stood in the library with the ring on her finger and her laughing at the precise improbability of what had happened, and he thought, this is what was missing. Not the management of a name. Not the performance of position. Not the careful maintenance of alliances and appearances, and the constant exhausting work of being what everyone expected. This. A woman who corrected his archive on a winter evening, who told him the truth without requiring him to thank her for it, who carried an old document to London because it was right, who told him not to protect her from her own choices, who said yes to both parts in the same breath. Are you frightened? He asked. She considered it seriously. Of the wedding a little. Of what Lady Harrington will say, not at all. Of what this means professionally. She paused. I've been thinking about that. And there are women in this county who have skills that no one values properly, she said. Document work, preservation, historical research. Women who know things that are treated as domestic rather than professional because no one has created the right structure. She looked at him. Wetherbourne Hall has space. It has resources. It has an archive that now demonstrates what proper historical preservation looks like. She paused. What would you think about using some of that to build something real? Training, instruction, a formal program? Alexander looked at her. You've been planning this, he said. Since January, she admitted. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but processing the full shape of what she was describing, matching it against what he knew about the estate's capacity and resources, and the particular gaps in what the county's educated women had access to. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." She looked at him as if she had expected more negotiation. "You didn't think I'd agree," he said. "I thought you might have concerns." "My concern," he said, "is that you have been planning this for 4 months and didn't tell me, which suggests you weren't sure I would take it seriously." She opened her mouth and closed it. "Take note," he said, "for future reference. I take you seriously. Everything you say, everything you plan, everything you propose, that is not going to change." He held her gaze. "Tell me these things, Clara. All of them." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm still learning how to do that," she said. "Assume that what I think matters." "I know," he said. "We have time." The Grenville case resolved in the autumn. Not fully legal processes of that complexity rarely resolve fully, and there were aspects that would continue into the following year. But the central determination was made, the codicil was authentic, the fraud was demonstrable, and the Grenville family had a valid historical claim. The specific remedy would take time to calculate. The justice, such as it was, had already arrived. James Grenville wrote to Alexander when the determination was announced. He wrote, "My great-grandfather spent his life believing that what had been taken from his family would never be returned. He died with that belief. I cannot undo that, and neither can you. But the fact that someone looked and found what had been hidden and came forward with it changes something for us that I did not know needed changing. Thank you, Your Grace. And please, thank Miss Everleigh." Alexander read the letter to Clara over breakfast. She sat across from him with her tea and listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He says it changes something," she said. "He does." "What does it change practically, I mean? The estate is gone. The generations in between that can't be undone." "No," Alexander said. "It can't." "Then what does it change?" He thought about this seriously because she asked serious questions and deserved serious answers. "It changes the record," he said finally. "What happened is now part of what is known rather than what is hidden. The Grenville family didn't lose because they were wrong. They lost because someone with more power decided to make them lose." He paused. "The truth doesn't restore what was taken, but it does determine what the story says. And that matters. To them. To the people who come after them." He looked at her. "You know this better than anyone. You've been preserving other people's stories your whole career." Clara looked at him. "You've been paying attention," she said. "I told you," he said. "You're not difficult to observe clearly." She smiled the small, real smile that she still produced without warning, and that still managed to be the most effective thing that had ever happened to his composure. The wedding was held in December. Not the grand social spectacle that the Duke of Wetherbourne's marriage might have been expected to produce. Clara had been direct about this from the first conversation about arrangements, and Alexander had been direct in return. "Your preference is my preference, and anyone who has opinions otherwise can direct them elsewhere." It was a private ceremony, attended by the people who had been present for what had actually happened. Margaret Whitmore came from Falmouth, which Clara had arranged because it felt right, and because Margaret had been waiting for resolution longer than anyone. Dawson attended in a personal rather than professional capacity, which he managed with his customary composure, and which was, Clara told Alexander afterward, one of the most touching things she had witnessed. Mrs. Aldrich cried, which surprised everyone, including Mrs. Aldrich. Cecilia Harrington attended. She was not her mother's representative. She came because Clara had sent her a note, and she came because she had decided sometime during the autumn that the woman who had documented a 50-year-old fraud and written to Lord Aldwych on her own terms was someone worth knowing. She told Clara as much directly at the reception. "I told my mother I was attending," Cecilia said. "She was not pleased." "I imagine not," Clara said. "She said it was a betrayal of social solidarity." Cecilia paused. "I told her that social solidarity had already betrayed several people in this story, and perhaps it was time to try something else." Clara looked at her. "What did she say to that?" "She said she needed her smelling salts." Cecilia said completely dryly. I believe she recovered. Clara laughed. The real laugh, unguarded, that Alexander had memorized in the library. Howe was standing across the room when it happened, in conversation with his solicitor and James Grenville, who had made the journey from Hampshire because Alexander had invited him, and because James Grenville had decided upon consideration that he wanted to look the man who had come forward in the face. He had arrived that morning and had been quiet for most of it. The specific quiet of someone absorbing an experience larger than expected. He was perhaps 40, lean, with the look of a man who had spent his life in modest circumstances and had learned to hold himself with dignity regardless. She laughs like that often, he asked, looking at Clara across the room. Not often enough, Alexander said, but regularly. James was quiet for a moment. My great-grandfather described the man who took the codicil in a letter he left for his children. He described him as someone who believed that what was convenient for powerful people was by definition right. He paused. I read that letter when I was 12. I've been thinking about it differently since your solicitor first wrote to me. How so? I used to think it meant that powerful people are corrupt, James said. Now I think it means that power doesn't determine what's right. People do. He looked at Alexander. You had everything to lose by coming forward. You did it anyway. Miss Everleigh came forward, Alexander said. I made it possible. Yes, James said. But you chose to. That's not nothing. Alexander looked at Clara across the room. She was talking with Margaret Whitmore, now the two of them in close conversation. Margaret with the expression of someone who has finally arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time. Clara was listening with the full patient attention she gave to everything that mattered. No, Alexander said. It's not nothing. In the months that followed, several things happened in the specific, undramatic way that important things often happen when they are allowed to proceed without performance. The restoration program at Wetherbourne Hall opened in the spring. 3 rooms in the West Wing. Good morning light 12. Women in the first cohort. The kind of instruction that treated what they already knew as a foundation rather than a deficiency. Clara ran it with the same directness she brought to everything, and within 2 seasons there was a waiting list, and within a year, 2 of the first cohort had taken on private commissions, and 2 more had been hired by other significant estates in the county. Pemwick's family negotiated a settlement arrangement with the Grenville line. Not everything the original codicil would have guaranteed, but a substantial acknowledgement facilitated by a legal panel that had found the authenticated evidence unambiguous. Pemwick himself withdrew from active social life in the county, which was in its way its own kind of verdict. Lady Harrington did not reconcile herself to the situation, but she did not pursue further action, which Clara assessed as the practical decision of someone who had calculated the cost of continued opposition against the strength of the opposition's position. Cecilia Harrington attended the first public demonstration of the restoration program, and afterward told Clara it was the most interesting afternoon she had spent in 2 years. Clara told her she was welcome any time and meant it. Dawson, who had worked for Alexander for 12 years, with complete competence and the specific loneliness of someone who cares deeply about an employer and watches from a careful professional distance, found himself in the altered atmosphere of Wetherbourne Hall, somewhat less careful. He laughed more. He offered opinions occasionally without being asked for them. He brought Clara tea every morning in the archive without being told, and Clara said, "Thank you," every morning directly, and without social ceremony. And Dawson found that this small exchange over time became something he looked forward to in a way he would not have known how to explain to anyone and didn't try. Mrs. Aldrich began putting flowers in the entrance hall vase. On an evening in late autumn, Alexander found Clara in the archive. This was not unusual. She spent most evenings there when she wasn't teaching, doing the ongoing maintenance work that a collection of this size continuously required. What was slightly unusual was that she was not working. She was sitting at the large table with her hands folded and her notebook closed and her eyes on the middle distance, which was her posture when she was thinking through something that mattered. He sat across from her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at him. "I'm thinking about the first night," she said. "I came here to do 3 days of work. I had a list of materials I brought with me. I thought it would be straightforward. Was it not straightforward? Nothing about it was straightforward, she said. But she said it without complaint, the way you describe something difficult that you would choose again. If you had known, he said, in advance. Everything that was going to happen, the Grenville case, the legal proceedings, Pemwick, the letter campaign, all of it. Would you have come? She considered this genuinely, with the seriousness she gave every real question. Yes, she said. But I would have brought a better coat. It was colder than I expected. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression he had come to think of as the one she reserved for him specifically, not the professional attention, not the careful evaluation of new information, but the specific warmth of someone who has found where they belong and is still quietly discovering the full dimensions of it. The archive will need to be expanded, she said. If the program continues to grow, we'll need to bring in collections for teaching purposes. Materials that students can practice on before working on irreplaceable originals. Whatever you need, he said. I'll also need additional staff. Trained staff, not just hired help. People who understand the work. I know. And the program should probably formalize its credentials, she said, so that the women who complete it have documentation that other estates will recognize. Clara. Yes. I agree with all of it, he said. All of it. Whatever it requires. He held her gaze. You don't have to build the case. I already believe in the work. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I'm still learning to accept that. I know you are, he said. You're doing well. She unfolded her hands and picked up her pen. One more thing, she said. Yes. The letter your great-grandfather wrote, to Elizabeth Whitmore, the one that started all of this. She looked at him. What was in the second half? The part with the heavier ink pressure, the part that mattered more to him. Alexander was quiet. He had read the full letter weeks ago, when the Grenville case had reached the stage where the full archive documentation was formally reviewed by the legal panel. He had read it, and had not spoken about it, because some things required time before they could be said. He writes about regret, Alexander said. Not specifically, he doesn't name what he did, but he writes that he has spent years telling himself that what he did was necessary, that the alternative was worse, that the family would have suffered either way. He paused. And then he writes that he no longer believes this, that he believes he made a choice that cost another family everything, and that no amount of telling himself it was necessary makes the cost acceptable. He looked at the table. He writes, I am an old man, and I cannot undo what I have done, but I want someone to know that I knew it was wrong. Not later. At the time. I knew, and I chose anyway, and that is the thing I cannot live with quietly anymore. The archive was completely still. He knew at the time, Clara said. Yes. And he still did it. Yes. Alexander paused. And then he spent the rest of his life writing letters to E, and making payments that couldn't repair what he'd done, and calling it management. He looked at her. My father read those letters. He wrote 2 words in a margin. I inherited a name, and a sealed archive, and a reputation for being above reproach. And you opened the door, Clara said. You found it, he said. I opened it. She looked at him. He knew it was wrong at the time, she said, not for the first time, because she was turning it over the way she turned things over when they had multiple dimensions. And that's what he couldn't live with. Yes. That's different from the people who convinced themselves it was right, she said. Your great-grandfather never convinced himself. He just chose anyway, and then spent 50 years unable to forget the difference. Is that better or worse? Alexander asked. She thought about it seriously. Neither, she said finally. It's just true. And the truth was in the archive the whole time, waiting for someone to look. She paused. That's what archives do. They wait. Everything you put into them, everything you hide in them, or seal in them, or hope will disappear, it waits. Patient as anything. She looked at him. 50 years. 100 years. It waits for someone with enough care to find it. Alexander looked at her, the woman who had sat in his library on a winter evening and held a letter to the candlelight and told him that someone wanted to erase where it came from and had looked at him without performance, without agenda, and simply shown him something true. "I spent half my life surrounded by people who wanted my attention," he said quietly. "I gave it to them the way you give anything to a demand, because it was required, not because it meant something." He paused. "And then one woman walked into my world and refused to ask for it. She sat in my library and read old letters and looked up only when she had something worth saying." He held her gaze. "That was the moment I finally understood the difference between being admired and being known." Clara set down her pen. She looked at him across the table, the same table where they had worked side by side through 50 years of hidden history, and 3 generations of silence, and one irreplaceable document that had survived its own burial, because one ordinary man had understood that the truth needed to exist somewhere. "You're known," she said. "For what it's worth. All of it." "It's worth everything," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. He held it. Outside, the autumn evening was moving toward dark, and inside the archive of Wetherbourne Hall, the collection stood organized and complete and legible, every document in its right place, every story in its proper sequence, the damage documented and the structure preserved, and the truth available at last to anyone patient enough to look. The Duke of Wetherbourne looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had come for 3 days and stayed for a life, and thought that the most significant things he had ever found had never announced themselves. They had been quiet. They had been sitting in a corner of a library, reading old letters by candlelight, not looking up. And he had been the one for once who had not looked away.